From 1970 to 1972, 11 boys went missing from the Houston Heights, Spring Branch, and Oak Forest. An eerie feeling of dread settled over these neighborhoods. Conversations and speculations abounded. People began to wonder if something sinister was at play. The parents of missing boys knew it and were constantly calling the police, checking in, reminding them that their sons didn't run away and that they were missing and in grave danger. Police insisted they were runaways and could do and did very little. Those boys became known as the Lost Boys. On our last episode, we went over some of them, and on this one, we'll continue with that long list. I don't want to eat up too much time here. There's a lot to go over, so I'm just going to go ahead and get started. My name is Jen Schaefer, and this is Crude Acts, Missing and in Grave Danger, The Lost Boys of Houston, Episode 4. By 1972, Dean Corll transitioned from the neighborhood Candyman to a cold-blooded, well-seasoned serial killer. Any semblance of humanity left in Dean Corll was gone. He had already killed 11 boys and lived at several different addresses around Houston. At this point in the story, he landed at a place off Schuler Street in the Washington Corridor area. Dean, along with his accomplice Wayne Henley, had already killed a boy there named Frank Aguirre. And though they had done that, and though he had 11 boys under his belt, Dean's persistent hunger hadn't even come close to being satiated. He and both David Brooks and Elmer Wayne Henley helping them, he was just getting started. But check this out. According to several sources, there seems to have been other boys who conducted illegal activity with and for Dean Corll. They were also boys who hung out at his several residences on several occasions. Among those teens was a 17-year-old named Mark Scott, who was close friends with both David Brooks and Wayne Henley. He grew up with them and lived on West 27th Street in the Heights. Mark was a trouble kid who had been arrested a few times. Allegedly, he used to steal things for Dean Corll, and he did some drug dealing. By April 1972, Dean had grown tired of Mark Scott, and he believed that he cheated him on some deals. Mostly, he thought Mark, with his bad boy behavior, that he was going to lead the police directly to him. So Dean told the boys he wanted to get rid of Mark, and he told Wayne specifically he needed his help to get the job done. So on April 20th, 1972, Dean invited Mark Scott over like he'd done 100 times before. This time was at his place off Schuler Street. When Mark showed up, Wayne was already there and drinking and smoking pot. He sat down with the two of them and they hung out as usual. They casually chatted. They all were drinking beer together. They were all smoking pot together. It was when Mark was at his most relaxed state that Dean shot Wayne a look and then tackled him. Mark fiercely fought him off. More than likely, he knew what was going to happen to him, but Dean, being older and larger, was able to win the scuffle and bind and restrain him. Dean then forced the tied-up Mark Scott into the bedroom where he raped him and repeatedly tortured him. He took these little incense cones and he lit them and he put them on Mark's body to burn. Wayne could hear his screams from the living room, so he turned up the music to drown it out. After Dean was done, he threw the boy back into the living room onto the floor. Mark, still bound, just laid there, naked and helpless, and he laid there all night after Dean went to bed. Elmer Wayne Henley was supposed to lay there with him or just sit by him or whatever and watch him all night to make sure he didn't get up and leave or escape. But Elmer Wayne Henley passed out on the floor next to him. When he woke up, Dean was leaning over to check on Mark, but somehow, some way, Mark had freed himself, and he had a knife. He used the knife to make a slice at Dean. The two of them began to tussle again. Wayne got up, ran to the bedroom, grabbed Dean's .22 caliber pistol off his dresser, and then yelled and pointed it, but not at Dean, at Mark. The tussling stopped. Mark raised his hands and looked at Wayne with fear and dread. He motioned for Wayne to shoot him in the head instead of what he knew was coming. But Dean ordered his 15-year-old apprentice to strangle him. Wayne did. He tried it. He did as he was told, and he started to choke Mark Scott. It was too tough of a job for him, so Dean finished the job. After the 17-year-old boy was dead, Dean and Wayne buried him on High Island Beach with others that they had buried before. When Mark Scott disappeared, his parents and younger brother desperately looked for him. They called everyone they knew, but no word. Then, a few days later, they received a postcard from Mark that he was in Austin working. His mother and father couldn't believe it. Their son, who was only a junior in high school, had left for Austin without saying a word to anyone. Mark even left behind his Honda motorcycle, which wasn't like him. It was his most favorite thing in the world. They were convinced that something terrible had happened to him. And, like the other families, their intuition was right. On May 21st, 1972, a 17-year-old kid named Billy Balch and his 16-year-old friend named Johnny DeLome showed up at Dean Corll's house on Schuler Street. Billy had known Dean for a few years. He worked for him back in the day at the candy factory. He also hung out at his place off of 402 West 16th Street, which was right down the street from where he grew up. Billy thought that he could count on Dean to help him out if he was in a jam, and this time Billy's friend Johnny, who had recently dropped out of high school, was in some sort of trouble. So Dean was known to lend money out to boys, of course, with certain favors in return, and these boys needed money, specifically Johnny. So they go over to Dean's place, and Dean was there with David Brooks and Wayne Henley, and they'd already been hanging out. Unbeknownst to the boys, Dean already told his dynamic duo that he wanted to kill Billy Balch. He had some sort of beef with him, same as he did with Mark Scott. So the boys come over. They don't know what's going to happen. The trio of them, David, Wayne, Dean, they overpowered the two boys and they tied them up. It didn't take long for them to overpower them and tie them up. They were getting really good at it by then. Dean and Wayne tortured the boys like the others, and they were getting really creative with it by then as well. They used a car battery to electrocute their male parts. They also inserted glass rods in that same part of their body and used tweezers to pull out their pubic hairs. Totally gross, I'm sorry, but this is the extent of the things that they were doing. After they were done torturing the boys, Dean ordered Henley to strangle Billy with a cord. So he did. And while strangling him, he called out to the other boys saying, "Hey, Johnny!" And when he looked at Wayne, he shot him in the head. After they were both dead, the trio buried them on High Island Beach. Billy Balch's mother, Janie, was very worried after her son disappeared. She knew in her gut that something was wrong. She filed a police report, and then 3 days later, a letter arrived marked from Madisonville, Texas, a town a little over an hour north of Houston. In it, it said the following.
Dear Mom and Dad, I'm sorry to do this, but Johnny and I found a better job working for a trucker loading and unloading trucks from Houston to Washington, and we'll be back in 3 to 4 weeks. After a week, I will send money to help you and Mom out. Love, Billy.
His family knew there was something off about the letter. For one, the handwriting was different on the envelope and the note. It was 2 different handwritings. And then, of course, 2, his father knew, and we could probably figure out, jobs like that don't exist. It just didn't work that way. Different people unload the trucks at different spots. The guys in the trucks are only responsible for driving, not the loading and unloading part. Billy's parents then checked with Johnny's parents, who claimed they got the same type of note from their son, and they too thought it was odd. It was just out of character. Johnny wasn't a very good speller, and all the words in the note were spelled correctly. Those notes, of course, were not written by the boys. They were just a ruse by their killers, the Houston mass murdering trio, Dean Corll, Wayne Henley, and David Brooks. Another 2 boys I want to talk about who were closely associated with Dean lived to tell about their time with him. Dean's beard of a girlfriend, Betty Hawkins, that I told you about in our prior episode, she's the one who mentioned these boys to Houston police. One of them was named Billy Rittinger, who graduated from Waltrip High School in 1970. This kid met Dean when he was just a little one. Dean propositioned Billy for sex repeatedly. This is what he said to cops. He would decline him until one day, for whatever reason, he agreed to stay the weekend at his house. This was when he was an older teen, not when he was a kid, but still, unfortunately, this was during the Houston mass murder spree that was going on, that he ended up there for the weekend. So the day that he stayed there, Dean picked him up and brought him to his house, where Wayne and David were already partying. This house was on Schuler. And then, of course, you guys know the pattern. They got wasted. They played the handcuff tricks on him. They tied him up. Billy said that Dean tied his hands to some metal hooks that were high up on the wall in his bedroom. And he tried to fight back as he was sexually assaulted. But then Dean told them, and I quote, if he didn't cooperate, he would call someone else over that was way worse than he was. Dean had his way with him, but unlike the others, he, along with his apprentices, decided to let him go. He just had to promise them that he'd never say a word to anyone, and he didn't, until Dean was finally shot and killed, and he testified in court. And finally, there was another kid who ended up living to tell about him, and that was Leroy Lewandowski, who grew up on East 6th Street, down the street from Dean and his mom, Mary. Police found pictures of him among Dean's belongings at his house. This boy was not raped or killed. Well, he might have been raped, but he wasn't killed. And he would round out the boys that we know were involved with him in some capacity. Betty was the one that told police about him as well. And they talked to him and he told them the story. He had no stories of molestation, though. After Dean's stint at Schuler Street, he moved again. This time was to 906 Westcott in the Westcott Towers. People who lived at the Westcott Towers said there were always teens, boys and girls, coming in and going out of the apartment, and that Dean would just hang out on the balcony with binoculars scanning the streets. It was alleged that Dean Corll had a metal bulletproof door installed at his place at the Westcott Towers, but who knows if that's true. But if it was, why did he do that and who was he afraid of? But what we do know is that at this location, 6 victims lost their lives. And this is who they were. His first victim at the Westcott Towers was a boy named Stephen Sickman. He is 17 years old. and this occurred on July 19th, 1972. That night, Stephen went to a party that was going on in the Houston Heights, and from there, he just disappeared. Relatives searched the neighborhood for him and never found him. They asked his friends if they'd seen him. They hadn't. His sister, who was the last to see him alive, was stricken with guilt. The two of them had a fight that evening before he left. What it seems like is that night, Dean's boys must have been at that party in the Heights, and they must have lured Stephen from the party to Dean's place at the Westcott Towers. There, he was more than likely raped, tortured, and killed, just like the rest, and his remains were later found on the beaches of High Island. A month later, August 21st, 1972, a 19-year-old named Roy Bunton, who affectionately went by Ikey, disappeared while on his way to work at a shoe store at the Northwest Mall off 610. Dean must have lured this boy on his own because the other boys didn't know about him. He did it much like he did with his first victim, Jeffrey. He picked him up, he took him to his apartment, he did his thing with him, and he shot and killed him. He later buried this boy in the boat shed. On October 2nd, 1972, two kids, a 14-year-old named Wally Semino, who lived on 24th Street, and a 13-year-old boy named Richard Hembry, who lived a few blocks away on 21st Street, never made it home from Hamilton Junior High School. They were last seen inside a white van, parked outside a Heights grocery store. They were spotted by a couple of friends who told police they tried to go up and talk to the boys, but another older boy got out of the vehicle and told them to get lost. We think that boy was David Brooks. David Brooks must have taken the two boys to Dean's place at the Westcott Towers. What police know is what Wally's mom told them. So she said later that evening, his mom said that she received a call and heard Wally's voice, and it said "Mama," and then there was a scuffle and a click, and the phone went dead. She told them that her son was friends with several of the boys who disappeared, and she also told him that she talked to the principal at her son's school, who told her over 20 boys who attended his school were reported missing at that time. The police told the families that there's nothing that they can do. And they didn't. Back then, they didn't do anything about runaways. They couldn't do anything about runaways. There was no protocol. But if they saw them while they were out patrolling, they'd stop and question them. That was the most that they could do. We know that that would never happen. We know that the boys met the same demise as their friends, and they were buried in the boat shed. The following month, on November 15th, 1972, a 19-year-old Spring Branch kid named Richard Kempner went missing. His mom, Joanne, frantically looked for him when she couldn't find him. She called his roommate. He said he hadn't seen him. She called her son's girlfriend. She hadn't seen him. After becoming very worried, she contacted the police, gave them his description: 5'7", athletic build, blue eyes, wavy light brown hair. She said he was a sweet and sensitive boy who did have a rebellious streak, but he also had a very kind heart, and he was a little naive, so she was worried that something happened to him. Like the others, police couldn't or just didn't do anything about it. They declared him a runaway. Joanne would sadly never see her son again. Dean took him, did his things to him, killed him, and he buried his remains on High Island Beach. That same month, like I said, he was on a roll during this time, but that same month, a 17-year-old boy named Willard Branch, who went by Rusty, he went missing. So this guy, Rusty, was also friends with all the Heights boys who had gone missing. He lived in the area. He even frequented the SPJST swimming pool, where, if you remember, David Hilligeist and Melly Winkle went missing from in 1971. Side note, that swimming pool that was operated by a Slovakian fraternal order was a magnet for Heights teenagers and would come to be a favorite hunting spot for Dean's apprentices. So this is this kid. He does all the things that the Heights boys do, and this day in November, he went missing. What happened, we believe, is that Wayne lured Rusty to Dean's place, and it wasn't hard to do. Rusty already knew Dean. Like many of the other boys, he had already been to his parties at as many places. According to Rusty Branch's sister, Sue, who was interviewed by the Houston Chronicle in 1993, her brother had been to Dean's parties several times before, and she even attended the parties where there were always illegal narcotics, marijuana, assorted pills people were huffing. She remembered seeing as many as 14 kids lounging in Corll's living room, passing back and forth joints, and sniffing glue and huffing paint. I'm going to talk more about this interview later in an episode because she also mentioned that there were other men there. And that's something that we're going to have to dig into because we know about the kids, but we didn't know until she said this that there were other men that were at these parties going in and out of the bedroom. But while Rusty was at the apartment, hanging out with Wayne, hanging out with Dean, Dean this time did a little something different. He drugged him. He slipped some drugs in his drink, and when he was out of it, he tied him to his torture board. The one that they found in his place off of Lamar Street, this torture board that he made with a piece of plywood and handcuffs and nylon ropes. He bound him to it, and from there, he had his way with him. He killed him, and he buried him in the boat shed. The thing about Rusty Branch is he was the only victim that Dean Corll castrated. We don't know why, but to add insult to injury, Rusty Branch's father was an HPD detective. And he unfortunately died before finding out what happened to his son, and maybe in some ways that's for the best. And that rounds out 1972. And also Dean's time spent at the Westcott Apartments. In January 1973, he moved to a place off of 1855 Wirt Road. These apartment complexes were called the Princessa Apartments. And when he moved in, it didn't take long for him to kill again. In an independent move, on February 1st, Dean Corll killed 17-year-old Joseph Lyles, and he did this by himself. Now, Joseph, this kid, was a sweet boy. He spent a lot of his free time at a West Houston skating rink. It is believed by his family it is from there that Dean could have possibly lured him to his apartment. Some believe Joseph stopped by his apartment looking for David Brooks, who he was friends with, but we don't know for a fact. Regardless, Joseph ended up at Dean's place. Dean drank with him, smoked pot with him, and then he made a move on him. But check this out. Joseph, when he tried to touch him in a way he didn't want to be touched, Joseph bit his hand to keep him off of him, which is totally out of character for this kid who was passive. He was just this artist who was a quiet, mild-tempered kid, but he bites him. Good for you, Joseph. But this angered Dean, and he snapped and he hit him. He hit him hard between his temple and his eardrum and hit him again, and it split his skull open and he died. And he then buried his remains on a beach in Jefferson County. By March 1973, Dean Corll moved out of the Princessa Apartments to a place that would become his final destination. And that's 2020 Lamar Street in Pasadena, Texas. During the short 5 months that Dean lived there, he killed 8 of his victims. We know that 29 victims total. He killed 8 of them at this place at Lamar Street in a very short amount of time. So in 1973, the first half of the year was quiet. Everyone retreated to their respective places and laid low. Wayne was with his family. David was actually married. He married this girl, and they had a baby together, and so they had their own apartment in the Heights. Dean was in Pasadena, alone, he was healing from that painful medical condition that I told you about. He was diagnosed with a hydrocele in his testicle, and it would flare up. And this specific time, it required surgery. So a hydrocele can form from like an injury or an infection in the scrotum. I wonder what could have caused that, Dean. Karma inflicted that one herself. Good for you, Karma. So he had this condition, he had surgery, he was laid up, so he couldn't do his thing. But after he was done healing, he went on a rampage. And it resulted in what many call a summer of blood. It started on June 4th. So he moved into the apartment in March. On June 4th is when he killed his first victim at this house. That day, the victim was a 15-year-old kid named William Lawrence, who went by Billy. This guy was 6 foot tall. He was a football player. He lived with his dad, Jimmy, off 31st Street between Ashland and Yale, which is the Shepherd Forest area. The day that Billy went missing, he asked his dad if he could go fishing with some friends at Lake Sam Rayburn. Unfortunately, that friend, quote unquote, was Wayne Henley. Henley lured Billy to Dean's house. We know how the story goes. According to David Brooks, who was there during this one, all three of them were there during this one, Dean Corll really liked Billy. So he kept him handcuffed to the torture board for at least 3 days. And when he was finished with him, he killed him, wrapped his body in plastic, loaded him into a wooden box, and took him out to Lake Sam Rayburn to bury him. Wayne was friends with him, and he said later that he felt really bad about this one, that he felt bad about what he did to Billy, yada, yada. But Billy's dad, who never liked Wayne, said he believed that Wayne broke into their house and stole a bunch of things after his son went missing. So I don't know, how sorry did he really feel if he did this to him and then broke into his house and stole some things. 11 days later, on June 15th, Raymond Blackburn, a 20-year-old, vanished while attempting to hitchhike from the Heights to Baton Rouge. He was eager to get home. He wanted to see his newborn child. So here he was hitchhiking. He got picked up by everyone's worst nightmare. It was the killer trio, and from there, we know his fate. He never got to see his child or his family ever again. He was killed and buried at Lake Sam Rayburn. On July 7th, Homer Lewis Garcia, who was only 15 years old, was lured to Dean's house by Wayne Henley. The two of them met at Coach's driving school in Bel Air. At the house, Homer, along with Brooks, Henley, and Corll, had a little party. They drank and smoked pot. They shot leftover fireworks from the 4th of July, and Homer even said this was one of the best times that he'd had in a long time. Wayne eventually brought out the old handcuff trick, and poor Homer fell for it. Dean attached him to the torture board and had his way with him, and then he shot him to death. They buried Homer at Lake Sam Rayburn. On July 12th, John Sellers, only 17 years old, disappeared a few days before his 18th birthday. Now, people have debated if this kid was a victim of the Houston mass murders or maybe he wasn't. There's some differences with this kid. He was the only one found on this area of High Island Beach that was 3 miles away from the other. And he was found shot to death with heavy caliber slugs, not a .22 pistol like the others. And he was one of the only ones buried fully clothed. They believe that he was a victim. I believe he was a victim, but some maybe think that he wasn't. John Sellers is July 12th. On July 19th, Michael Anthony Balch, who went by Tony, disappeared. And he was only 15 years old, and he went missing after going to get his hair cut. You may recognize that last name. His older brother was Billy Balch, who, with his friend Johnny DeLome, went missing the previous year. I told you about those boys earlier in this specific episode, actually. So Tony, a younger brother, was known to run away. from time to time. So their dad, Billy Jean, when he reported him missing, police refused to do anything about it. This is a common theme. This happened with every single one of them. But Mr. Balch, who now had 2 missing sons, decided to take things into his own hands. He looked everywhere for them, day and night. But of course, we know that he never found them and that he never would. Tony was buried in the woods of Lake Sam Rayburn after he was killed by Dean Corll. On July 25th, 2 boys, Charles Cobble and Marty Ray Jones, both 18, were last seen walking along 27th Street in the Houston Heights. Charles was a tall kid with blue eyes who walked with stooped shoulders due to his lack of self-esteem. His mother, Betty, claimed he was scared of everything, including his own shadow, and she in turn was an overprotective mother. Marty, this kid Marty Jones, had a rough home life, so Betty Cobble, who was known to take in stray boys, she let him move in. But Marty was a handful. He used drugs at the house, he stole things, so they kicked him out. And after that, he lived at a series of places, including with a drug dealer who called himself Satan. This is a 17-year-old, 18-year-old boy, so that's just petrifying to think about. Charles eventually moved out of his parents' house, and he moved into the Ben-Hur apartments in the Heights with his girlfriend. Marty eventually moved in with them and pitched in with money he made drug dealing. Marty apparently had a reputation on the streets. He was known as a drug dealer and a ripoff artist and even a sadist. So I don't know. Those are rumors. That's what I read. I was going to include it, but who knows? This kid, Marty, could have been a great kid. The night the 2 of them disappeared, Charles and Marty, they were hanging out with Wayne Henley. They were last seen with Wayne walking to his house along 27th Street. A friend of theirs said he stopped and tried to talk to them, but they didn't want to have anything to do with him, so he drove off. And that was the last anyone ever saw of the 2 guys. The next day at 9:50 in the morning, Charles called home and he asked his father for $1,000. He said that he and Marty were in trouble, but his dad told him that he didn't have that kind of money laying around. $1,000 in 1973 is might as well have been a bajillion dollars. But Charles, hearing that his dad couldn't come up with it, told him to talk to a guy named Mr. Rogers who could help him out. But when Vern Cobble, his dad, said he didn't know who that was, Charles then sighed and he hung up the phone. Vern waited for him to call back, but he never did. He tried to get the police to come out, but they never came. And from that point, the boys just disappeared. Betty Cobble eventually asked her brother, Chester Doby, to find this guy named Mr. Rogers that her son was talking about on the phone to his dad. Maybe if they found him, he could lead them to where the boys were. So this guy Chester goes out to look around to find this guy, Mr. Rogers, and he did. He finally found him. And come to find out, this guy was a big-time drug dealer. When Chester found him, he was shot at, so he backed off. He said it seemed as if he accidentally was stirring up an illegal narcotics nest in Houston. So he, in turn, didn't go back, and he never found his nephew Charles or his friend Marty. Of course, we know what happened to them. Just like the others, they were both tortured and victimized by Dean Corll and his apprentices. Charles was shot and killed, and Marty was strangled, and they were both buried in the boat shed. The last known victim of the Houston mass murders was a kid named James Dramala. He was only 13 years old. On August 3rd, 1973, James was last seen riding his bike in his Pasadena neighborhood. His house was off Laurel Creek, which was less than 2 miles away from Dean Corll's house off of Lamar. James was out riding his bike collecting Coke bottles to turn in for money so he could take his girlfriend to the movies. That day, as he reached 2020 Lamar Street, he was stopped by a guy named David Brooks, who then told him his friend Dean had lots of Coke bottles. If he wanted them, he just had to come inside. Sadly, that lure worked, and it was only hours later that he ended up on Dean Corll's torture board, and he was molested and assaulted, and Dean strangled him with a nylon cord. He and his bike both ended up in Dean Corll's boat shed. He was the last victim, and it's one of the saddest because this kid was just an innocent kid out riding his bike, and he ended up meeting the worst people possible. But here's the thing. 5 days later, Dean Corll, the Candyman, the Pied Piper of Houston, was shot and killed by his apprentice, Elmer Wayne Henley Jr. Now, as much as I despise what Wayne did and for his part in these vicious, cruel, and crude acts, I applaud him for taking out Dean Corll. I just wish that he would have done it sooner. Because no matter the truth as to how things really went down, the day Wayne shot and killed Dean, he ended a 3-year-long killing streak. When he killed Dean, that was the end of it. That was the end of the Houston mass murders and their killing spree. And for now, that's the end of this episode. But, of course, we know it's not the end of the story. On our next episode, we're going to talk about the aftermath of the Houston mass murders, the complications, and the residual effects that persist, even to this day. It's a lot to go over. There's a few different things that I want to address. So we're going to go that, and that's going to round out the little series that I'm doing about Dean Corll. And from there, we'll go on to talk about how this case is connected to a much bigger one. Stay tuned. Thank you for listening to all of that. I know it was a lot. I know the thought of this happening, going over what happened, it is heart-wrenching, it is sad, and it's shocking that something like this could happen. But it did, and there's more to it than that. So thanks for listening. Thank you for continuing to listen. That's the end of this episode. I'm Jen Schaefer, and this is Crude Acts, a Texas true crime podcast. I research and host this thing. I get a lot of help from Russell Dunlap, who does my sound editing. Amy Dunlap manages, and she's working on some merch, including custom pens and notebooks, for you to take notes and follow along as we investigate. We'll have some shirts and some coffee mugs and stuff like that available on our website, www.crudeacts.com. Be on the lookout for that if you want some cool stuff. As always, all original music is by Houston's own 2-Star Symphony. Check them out online. They're amazing. Come back for the next episode. You can hear about, I can talk about the complications of this case, and I can get out all the things that are swirling in my head. It just makes me feel better. But have a good one. We'll see you next time. Thank you. Bye-bye.